This is the Storypunks podcast, the show where we talk about all the punks, so steampunk, dieselpunk, cyberpunk, and all the other punks. I'm your host, Cindy Grigg. This is episode 50, and it will continue with episode 51. It's a two-parter, Steampunk. I do have the host of Radio Retrofuture, Dankaert Lexicon, on the show with me. He is a popular YouTuber, and he has all kinds of amazing playlists over on his channel. So I want to start right off by showing you a little bit about Radio Retrofuture if you have not checked it out already. I would just go to YouTube and search for Radio Retrofuture, and you'll see his wonderful symbol here. It says RRF. That's how you know you'll have the right channel here. And I'm going to share a snippet of the autoplay that engages when you come to the channel.
Radio Retrofuture.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and a wonderful 2019 to you. I am Dankaert Lexicon, and let me welcome you to a whole new episode of the Steampunk Beginner's Guide. Today we're going to talk about a subject recommended to us by writer Jeremy Vesmeyer, who asked us to talk about steampunk technology. Originally, this was intended to be one long video on the subject. However, due to the information density, we decided to cut it up in several topics.
So obviously this clip is one of his Steampunk Beginner's Guide videos, but he has so many different playlists, so many different resources on his channel. For example, if you go over to playlists, you'll see the Steampunk Beginner's Guide. You'll also see interviews. He has like 96 the last time I was over here, and he has events, footage from events he's been to. And talk about an amazing set. He really does some amazing costuming and capturing of the ambiance of steampunk. And I'm so excited to share this interview with you. Just really quickly on my personal update, it is a holiday week here in the United States. So next week actually is the holiday week. So just as a reminder, we will not have episodes next week, but you do have this double episode. Hopefully that will tide you over, and there's plenty of content here with Dankaert Lexicon. I'm actually heading to a lake near my home, but I will be off grid. And so that's why we're not having an episode next week. But this is kind of a fun little journey and part of my personal update that I've been feeding to you ongoing. This is kind of one of those weird things where you can live in a place and have no idea of some of your surroundings. So I have been looking for land, and in the process of that, I came across this wilderness area. I think it's national forest land. But basically, I just saw a whole bunch of cars driving up this passage, and it wasn't clearly marked. And so I just followed them. It was basically thinking, where are all these people going? So as I did, I came across this gorgeous, gorgeous lake, probably the prettiest one I've seen in my state. I mean, I just couldn't even believe it. And as I learned more about it, it's actually kind of a destination for people, especially from out of town. But I'm telling you, I have never even heard the name of this lake mentioned in my life. So it's pretty strange because I get out and I go to some of these, places near my house. And I mean, it was just really bizarre. So I wonder if there's something like that in your area. Maybe there's stuff you haven't explored. Maybe that's an idea for something to do over the holiday. I don't know, but that's what I'm doing. And I'm really excited to just break away and have a little bit of time. So I'll just remind you, if you're ever interested in checking out my writing, which is always in flux, which I'm still trying to roll out in the best way, but you can always find the status, no matter when you're listening to this, over at cindygrigg.com, CINDYGRIGG.com. And I am writing steampunk, so it's in keeping with this wonderful conversation that we're having. And editing this at this particular time has been really, really cool as far as some of the stuff I'll be working on over this holiday break and everything else. So without further ado, let's get right into it. There's so much that we're going to cover. In part one, we'll cover his channel, YouTubing, steampunk in general, and his interpretation of steampunk, and so many other cool things. We'll also start talking about his projects, and then in part 2, we're going to continue with that. So tons of stuff for any creative who's storytelling in the steampunk genre. Here we go. Dankaert Lexicon is the host of Radio Retrofuture, an informative channel on speculative fiction, steampunk, and other forms of retrofuturism. And throughout this interview, you will hear me refer to him as Bonsart, which is his non-steampunk name. Bonsart, it's so wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about your set there. It is gorgeous. Any steampunk is going to be green with envy, and there's really a lot of cool stuff going on. Will you take us through some of it?
Well, what you see behind me is my bedroom, which I also use as my recording studio. And it so happens that I built this particular background myself. And some other parts of my house as well. It's all in a very I wouldn't say similar style, but it's a decor, as to speak. Immersion is very important for me, and I want to be connected with my environment. So I have implemented things that I liked. Thought a lot about it. Color is also very important to me. The background here is very elaborate. The rest of the bedroom is not, because I simply did not get the proper inspiration for it yet, but I might have very soon. But I've got so many things going on right now. My main focus is on creating videos. And, people may not realize this, but when I make an episode, for example, the Steampunk Beginner's Guide, the average episode takes me over 10 hours to make.
Oh, I believe it, Bonsart.
I also have a regular day job. And, most of my earnings and most of my free time go into making videos and arranging stuff for my other projects. So, yeah. But recently I got a new lamp that I made with a friend of mine. Really happy with that. And I hope if everything goes well, we can also bring that to events. So that's a thing.
Very cool. So there is some really neat lighting going on for anyone who is just listening. There is kind of a purplish reddish hue through everything. Is it the same in real life, or is that just what the camera effects are bringing?
Oh, no. I have, this is a Philips Hue system. So it's basically LED lights I can turn into any color I want.
Cool.
And today I felt like making it purple because, you need proper lighting when you want to make videos. And so, I was looking for alternatives, and you just happens to be a really good alternative. There are cheaper brands, but they come from China and places like that. So, and this is a proper Dutch brand, so we go with that.
Okay, now where are you joining us from?
I'm in the Netherlands.
Beautiful. Okay, so again, please check out his awesome style, as you can see in the Storypunks episode, which is on the Storypunks channel on YouTube, and then you'll, of course, see links to Bonsart's wonderful channel, Radio Retrofuture. So Bonsart, on this show, we discussed the punks, and today we're focusing on steampunk, retrofuturism, any other time adjacent or time related terms you might be interested in. Which ones do you relate to the most, and what are your definitions of these different punk or punk adjacent terms?
I only use steampunk, and I'm really pragmatic in that because no one has ever given me a satisfactory definition of the other punks, and they often contradict you another, so I don't use them. I find them extremely impractical. I don't even like the term steampunk, to be honest with you. I made a whole episode where I go into the nitty gritty with my problems with all these different punks and whatever punks. So yeah, I just use steampunk, but mostly interesting is just in storytelling, and it just happens that I like science fiction, I like history. And the people who connect with that are into the punks. And that's my approach to it.
I think there's many people who take that same approach. They may not particularly be fans of it, but they're still, it's a useful tool, a useful way to magnetize people that you might be sharing things with. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's like they have like just for, I grew up with the term Weird West, and I think they have like now 5 different names for that.
I think so.
So it's like, okay, well, people ask me to comment on these, but it's like, okay, so you want me to basically make the Steampunk Beginner's Guide all over again,
right?
Just with a different adjective in a thing, something punk. So I had this, Diesel Punk says, can you make an episode on Diesel Punk? And instead I made a vlog about it, like my issues with Diesel Punk. Like, I accept there is a Diesel Punk community, but I had a discussion with Eric Fisk. I think you had him on the show at some point. And,
not yet, but
the way how he sees Diesel Punk and how I see Diesel Punk as an outsider, I have to add to that, is very different. So, you're dealing with concepts that are so subjective. And the reason why I started blogging, I used to have a blog called Tupperware Steampunk, and I called it Tupperware Steampunk because anything could be steampunk. Like, why can't Tupperware be steampunk? And no one. Then they would say, well, obviously it's not steampunk. But when you do a certain thing with it, then all of a sudden it was steampunk. So that seemed a bit odd to me. So I dedicated myself to like analyzing like what is it that unites steampunk to begin with, because I do my own interviews. I had over 100 guests now in total, I think, including the panel. So, and there's this cliche. It's almost a cliche, really, that people did stuff. People said, hey, that's steampunk, and all of a sudden they get into steampunk. But the real thing is, and the real thing why this happens is it just happens to be the right audience for steampunk. So, like, to me, when people ask me, like, what is steampunk, complete novice, someone who has no idea what it is, I reply, okay, first off, there are 3 different things. It's the story genre, it's the aesthetics, and it's the community. So those are already 3 completely different things. So that's already something you need to be very clear about when you're discussing steampunk, as it were. And a lot of people conflate those things as they are the same. And, that makes defining the concept impossible. But for me, as to what steampunk is, it just happens to be a source of inspiration for me. And most of all, the stuff people create. And those very people also are my audience. So it's a really complex thing when you think about it. But I think the most important thing about steampunk is that it is both an audience, but also a group of creators. And a lot of people talk about, the Victorian thing. They define it as, oh yeah, it's Victorian. And then, well, look at me. I mean, then apparently I'm not steampunk because I don't use the Victorian aesthetics. Barely. I use the colors that are tropes of steampunk. So there's that. And, but no one would say, oh, you're not a steampunk, that I'm doing steampunk wrong. Well, of course, there are a few people, but when you look at the like to dislike ratio on my videos, I think you would agree most people don't agree with that. So when you talk about the Victorians, it's just, well, yeah, it's steampunk, but it's only a fraction of what is the total
of what steampunks and steampunks are and what steampunks create, because there are also a lot of pop culture tropes. And I think that's really interesting about steampunk, is that it has pop culture tropes from like the 1800s till pop culture tropes from 2019. So when something is popular in pop culture now, you're bound to see it in steampunk. And I think that it makes it very easy for people to relate to steampunk, because it has both those historical references and those modern pop culture tropes.
Yeah, it is very, I love that. And it is very complicated. And I like that you gave 3 areas that people could start to unwrap that in, unpack that in, and as they're thinking of their own definitions. And that's why I like to start with that question, because everybody gives me different answers. And I think that says a lot. So can we unwrap just a little bit more this awesome phrase you've been using, cyberpunk, in the past, just for anyone who's completely new, who may not be as used to the retrofuturism concept? How would you describe that to them?
Well, I'll just use the first book that was actually written as Steampunk, which was written by William Gibson and Sterling. For those who are not aware, the term steampunk was made up by K.W. Jeter in a letter to Lotus magazine. It's also in the Steampunk Beginner's Guide, by the way. And, there was this collection of stories, and he said, well, we should call this Steampunks or something like that. And William Gibson and Sterling basically took that idea and said, okay, we're going to write cyberpunk in the past. That was their original definition of steampunk, cyberpunk in the past. For those who are not aware, William Gibson is a very famous cyberpunk writer, and some say he's the founder of cyberpunk. Maybe true. I am not that familiar with cyberpunk's history, but he's one of the most notable writers in that genre. He wrote Neuromancer and a lot of other books. And the difference engine is a simple plot. Like I said, steampunk originally, like science fiction, is a high concept genre. And they asked the simple what if question. What if the Victorians had functional computers? So the inventor of the first computer, his computers didn't work, but in this what if story, they do work. So the Victorians start creating their empire with the help of difference engines or computers. And, well, that's where you get the cyberpunk in the past. So you've got to deal with, the Victorians had to deal with information such as privacy and the fact that, once it gets in the database, it stays in the database, things like that. And I like that concept because I like science fiction. Not a big fantasy guy. And, it's like it's nice and defined for me that way. Okay, you take in my case of my universe, it's like, okay, what if the historical Victorians have access to all these different worlds, and how will they adapt, right? And so there are a lot of borders to what they can do. They cannot stay longer than 40 days in another dimension, otherwise they'll disintegrate and stuff like that. But there is a large fantasy aspect to that as well, because I just made up that entire world, for example. So there is this weird balance that a steampunk author needs to strike between, okay, what is probable scientifically, and you also have to add that suspension of disbelief to it. So it's really hard, and I think that's also the reason why there are so many fantasy quote unquote steampunks. Steampunk stories that are aesthetically steampunk, or they're Victorian, but for the rest it's all fantasy. I can't recall her name, but right now I have just finished listening to the Parasol Protectorate's first book, which is about the Victorian age, but with vampires and werewolves.
By the inestimable Gail Carriger. Yeah,
that's her name. Yeah. So that is fantasy, but it has that scientific twist to it. So I really love that about that book. Like, okay, it's fantasy, and a lot of it's like I'm clearly not the target demographic for that book. But there is this scientific approach to that concept, and how how these werewolf acts and interact with humans and stuff like that appeals to me.
Yeah, it's absolutely excellent.
Yeah. And so, but yeah, there are a lot of steampunks that are just, well, they're aesthetically steampunk, but for the rest, they're just typical fantasy stories. And that seems to be the most of the stuff I see online. Like, especially with young people, they love this steampunk aesthetics, but they want to be dragons, or they want to ride dragons, or they want to be vampires. So then, that's why the definition of steampunk, of defining it as, for example, Victorian science fiction, does not work. Because that's just not the reality of where steampunk is heading. Because I see steampunk as this organic thing, not this static, easily defined thing. It grows and it develops. And, for example, the aesthetics are going more and more into dieselpunk. And for me, that is still steampunk. It's just the way steampunk develops. And the dieselpunks will say, well, no, that's dieselpunk. But, well, I'm not gonna delve into that subject. But, that's just an example of how steampunk develops. And people seem to obsess over the labels, and rather, like, people approach me, yeah, well, what do you think of these particular aesthetics in Fallout? Doesn't that make it dead punk or plunger punk and brick punk? And, well, there are also tires in that game, so it must be tire punk, right? It's so arbitrary to me. And that frustrates me about these discussions. Well, we're gonna have to talk about the fact that there's a VCR in Fallout. I don't care. It's a freaking VCR, and they're not talking about, well, okay, how is steampunk developing, or what does this mean, or what does this mean for where the genre is going. There's too much obsessing over arbitrary aesthetical things like, oh, look, there are nails in that wall. It must be called nail punk. Look at TV tropes. Are you familiar with that website?
Yes, it's really cool. You can find all kinds of character tropes.
Yeah, but have you read the actual articles? Because I feel like people are reading like, oh, they've got all these different types of punk, and don't read on, because either the punk genres there are interchangeable, or they're like, yeah, well, this is an example of sandal punk, but here we can see plunger punk and leather punk, and none of them can stand on themselves.
I think it's a really valid point. And number one, if anybody wants more of this awesome passion that we're hearing from Bonsart, then make sure to go check out his videos, because he really gets into this. It's really fun. And then also, I think, you talked about TV tropes and their articles and stuff. I think it's cool because they're like listing out the possibilities, or they're just kind of covering the material, but it doesn't mean that everything you read in every article is like a legitimate, like you said, standalone genre that's totally going to take off. What do you think about that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, like it's kind of the flavor of the day.
Yeah.
For some reason, 2012 was the year for steampunk. Everybody was writing over steampunk. Everyone had to give their political interpretations to steampunk. So that is a role. Like a lot of bloggers all of a sudden pushing solar punk as the next big thing. And the same goes for dieselpunk. All of a sudden, everybody was talking about dieselpunk, and now there is this retrofuturism Discord server. They have this entire list of all these versions of punk, and I really don't know what to do with it. Whenever somebody mentions it to me, well, what's your opinion on I don't know, cardboard punk?
Well, you're not alone. I think it's a very valid point.
Yeah.
And one we have to consider on this show. We talk about a range of punks. We talk about solar punk on this show. We talk about eco-punk, diesel punk. And that's what's cool, is to come together and share different perceptions like this. I love it. So thank you. Okay, so you mentioned, actually, let me start with this. You hail from the Netherlands, as you said. Can you give us a state of steampunk in that part of the world?
Yeah, well, I think it's stable or growing. Quite honest, I'm not that involved with the convention community. Like I'm more focused on the genre itself and the aesthetics, so to speak. So I'm not really that involved with the community. I'm involved with the online community.
Okay, great.
So I think there's a difference there in what I do and what my approaches are. And also there was the fact that I had some issues in the family these last 18 months. So that also prevented me from putting too much effort into conventions and stuff like that. And when I go there, I usually like to go there as an entertainer. So I have 2 theme groups, as it were. So I have a Discord a group for Radio Retrofuture, and it's growing. So that is fun. My YouTube channel, the subscriber count isn't growing as fast, but the minutes watched are. So there is either a growing interest, or YouTube just pays more attention to me because my views are consistent. I don't know. That's very hard to tell with platforms like YouTube. And I recently joined Animo, which is an app you can just download, and it has I wouldn't know how to really. It used to be what Facebook was in the old days,
Okay.
like just a scroll down screen where people could post blogs and pictures and whatever. So I like it, and I also get a lot of attention on there as well. And the people on there are relatively very young, like teens. So I get a lot of teen viewers from there who, they have their own interests, like a lot of anthropomorphic steampunks, so to speak, that kind of thing. So that is something. And I also made a series, Radio Retrofuture for Fallout, I call it, on the internet. It's part of a mod for Fallout 4. This is a mod called Old World Radio. It adds dozens of new radio stations to the game for the people who are familiar with it. And I also managed to create a radio station for that game with steampunk music. So that way I have all the people who download that mod and play Fallout 4 now can listen to steampunk music. So I also get viewers from there as well. And now I get messages from bands from, oh yeah, we now have fans in Russia because they listen to the mod and they look for the band. So, I'm a lot about what I hope to do is reach out, like not just look for my audience inside the steampunk community, but also from outside the community. I think that's something that's very important.
Absolutely.
And it's basically it's also called Radio Retrofuture. Not my idea, but the person who created the mod wanted it to be called that way. He also wanted me to use my natural voice. Also not my choice.
Really? What voice would you have chosen?
Oh man, that's a long time ago. I tried several things. One of them was my character Dankaert, which I thought was a bit weird, but anyway.
Yeah.
I auditioned with several voices, but he wanted my natural voice. And speaking of voice work, I've also auditioned for a new podcast, Clockwork, the Steam Age, and I also will do a character for that, they also asked me to use my natural voice. So apparently my voice is something that's really appealing to Americans. I don't know.
It could be because it's more unusual over here. It probably does seem strange to you, but it's a great voice. So
thanks.
Yeah. Now, the other thing I was going to mention is Discord. So you mentioned Discord, and that's a gamer's kind of social media platform or communication platform, right?
Yeah. Well, it is originally created for gaming. It's ideal for gaming, I must say, but it has grown out to be much more than that. Especially small companies who want to have a direct line to their contributors, like with Kickstarters, for example. It's often used for things like that. I also use it to stay in contact with my community, bring people together. And I get people with various interests because of my approach. So it's an app. You can also download it for your mobile phone. You can also use it on PC. And it has a number of great community features, like it has fora-like functions, but it also has group chat function. And I also use it to record my podcasts because of the audio quality is far better. And I also now support multiple cameras, which is also good. It's quite new, actually.
I didn't know that. That's very cool.
Yeah, I love that program. And, I used Skype in the beginning. But, as soon as Discord came around, I tossed Skype because I always hated it and I still don't like it. I tried other ways of communication, but yeah, Discord pretty much made them all obsolete. So
very cool. Okay, one more thing I want to dig deeper on is you mentioned these troupes. You have a couple troupes that you take to different conventions and stuff. Will you tell us about that?
Well, the first troupe I created was Ragtag, Regiment Anachronistic Grenadiers. So that was the first one, and basically I was going to several conventions. It was like, okay, you've got all these steampunks, all these adventurers with all these guns, but no opponents to use them on. So basically, I was then one day I like old militaria. It's what I wear on a daily basis, actually. And I saw these Swiss Army coats, several of them hanging around, and it was like, "Ooh, that's pretty awesome." They have a very unique color to them. There's no army with a similar color to theirs, and oh, that's quite awesome. And I convinced a friend of mine to also get a coat like it, and we created this base uniform, so to speak, of a faceless goon, as it were, who just happened to look really cool because they had taste back then. So yeah, the military underclass of steampunk, basically. So really popular, but it was too much work. So we decided to stop it. It was fun though, but exhausting and logistic-wise a nightmare. So we stopped that, and now we have something we call red racing, which is like teapot racing, where they basically have these remote control cars, and well, they put teapots on them and stuff like that. I have interviews with the people who came up with the idea. Lisa Rooney, I think, one of my first interviews.
Very cool. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, she's the creator of the first teapot race. But the problem I had with teapot racing was, you need a flat background so you can do it on grass. So that's a problem. So that takes logistics. And the remote control cars don't have that much power in them. So when you put things on them, they couldn't traverse a lot of the obstacles. So you can only do teapot racing on certain times a day under certain conditions. And I was like, well, it's a good idea, but it's not very practical. So then one day, a friend of mine came up with, well, what if you use very small remote cars and you bring your own course? So we have a fold-up course, which you can just, open up, and it's there. Right now we're in the process of building a new one with an entire city in it.
Cool.
Yeah. And you can, do that all day. And you don't even need to watch it, because they're kids. They just want to play with toy cars, right? And you explain how it works, and they start racing, and then you walk away, and then the kids start teaching each other how the remote control cars work. So it's an ideal activity and a lot of fun, and it attracts a lot of attention.
Very cool. Okay, well, I've been nerding out. Let's talk about your YouTube channel. I've been nerding out over the Steampunk Beginner's Guide series because there's such a wry sense of humor that you're putting into those. It's a multi-video series, and I was hoping you would just give an overview of the series, but also maybe some insight to other creators who are looking to create something like that with so many dimensions. You have audio, video, obviously the background, the costuming, the whole production.
So I write and direct and myself. the character of Dankaert Lexicon, who I use in the video, already existed. I used to do, like I said, I had a blog called Tupperware Steampunk in the beginning, and I wanted to do interviews with steampunks. And I wanted to do something different. I wanted to do it like in character and kind of like, okay, if you're interviewed by this character, in what kind of environment? So I would start these interviews. Oh, yes, I'm meeting this person in the top of the Big Ben, for example. Or you know, if there were a fashion designer in their store or workshop, places like that. And I was like, okay, but what kind of character would it be? And that's kind of how I came up with Dankaert being a clanker who could hack his way into secured areas. He also got a Pip-Boy, it's a computer for on your arm. A friend of mine made it for me. He is called Niels Dijkstra. You can find him on Facebook under the same name, or as Rattles and Wheels, and he is one of the best steampunk creators I know. He just doesn't make all that much, and he doesn't like the limelight, so he makes a lot of stuff for me instead. And he made this beautiful contraption. I don't have it with me right now, but you can watch the Steampunk Beginner's Guide and you'll see it. But yeah, the thing was, I wanted to take pictures, except I had to take my mobile phone out all the time, so it was like, okay, I need this somewhere else, and that's he came up with the arm thing and the fold-up stock, so it can actually fold up.
It's actually practical. That's cool.
It's actually practical. Yeah, that's very important for me. Like before I got into steampunk, I was doing reenactment for about 10 to 12 years, and so you know, when I created my gear, it didn't just have to be historically correct. It also needed to be practical. The armor needed to be practical. The weapons needed to be carried practically. So, yeah, the practicality is something really important to me. And especially because, you know, when I make a costume, I also think about the storytelling. Like, what kind of character is this? Why is he wearing certain things? But yeah, I'm thinking of deleting a number of videos because I noticed there are nearly 300 videos on there right now, and many, like the Radio Retrofuture for Fallout videos, which are basically just a fictional radio station, are over or nearly an hour. So, but you can listen to those at work, for example.
Okay, Storypunks, let's pause here and do a little intermission. It's the end of episode 50, but before you jump into episode 51, I hope you'll take this little break to just go ahead and answer the survey. This is kind of the last call for the survey I've mentioned in the last couple episodes. It is still posted over at storypunks.world/survey. And answering that really contributes to where this show is going to go in the future. So if you've had an opinion as you've listened and you've thought, man, I could do with more of this, less of this, I wish I could send Cindy this information so she could make it even better, even more streamlined for what I need. Well, that's what this is. So I really hope you'll take advantage of it. It helps me. It helps everybody else listening. I'm going to just amalgamate all of the feedback and then create the next steps going forward for this season and heading into the next one. So thank you for contributing. Again, go to storypunks.world/survey. It's the perfect break before we jump into episode 51.